What if I told you that the world we live in today was shaped by a series of revolutions that shook entire empires to their core? From the streets of Paris to the fields of Italy, from the American colonies to the heart of Europe, these weren't just political upheavals, they were the birth pangs of our modern world. In this video, we'll talk about the series of revolutions that shook the entire world and whose effects we still feel today. In fact, the Age of Revolutions is an inseparable part of the Enlightenment. Contrary to popular belief, it did not begin with the French Revolution, but with the American Revolution. It would be unfair to characterize the American Revolution as merely an independence war waged by 13 colonies against the British Empire. This revolution not only created an independent state, but also produced a federal republic based on a constitutional foundation, an extraordinary system for the 18th century. The economic effects of the American War of Independence, which was part of the American Revolution, triggered the French Revolution. The French Revolution released many genies from their bottles: nationalism, the separation of church and state, the abolition of serfdom in France, the birth of today's political movements, the collapse of absolute monarchies, and the rise of parliamentary monarchies and republicanism. One of the most fervent effects of the French Revolution was nationalism. Nationalism gave identity to human communities that formed parts of classical empires and transformed their desire to break away from the empires they belonged to into a powerful armed struggle. Independence struggles that began with the founding of the United States continued with the Haitian War of Independence, the Latin American Wars of Independence, and the revolts and independence struggles within the Ottoman Empire, followed by the tremendous uprising known as the Indian Rebellion. All the struggles we know as wars of independence are wars that were won. Those that could not be won took their place in history as revolts. The 19th century was a period when weak empires such as the Ottoman Empire and the Spanish and Portuguese empires shrank through wars of independence, while at the same time, European great powers expanded their gains in Asia and Africa with renewed appetite. For example, the colonization of Africa turned into a race during this period, and this race entered the literature as the Scramble for Africa. How much impact independence wars and revolts had on the transition to the modern world in the 19th century is quite debatable. If we set aside the very special example of the United States, for instance, the Latin American and Central American countries that won their independence from Spain and Portugal could not establish proper political and economic systems. For decades, they exhausted their energies with factional conflicts, military juntas, civil wars, and struggles among these newly independent states with each other. The most fortunate periods for Latin American countries were the years when they sold agricultural products and industrial raw materials to the Allies, especially to Britain and the United States during both world wars. The Balkan countries such as Greece, Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, and Romania, which gained their independence from the Ottoman Empire during the 19th century, lived a turbulent life until their European Union membership and became outposts or satellites of great powers in the Balkans. Later, African and Middle Eastern countries that would gain their independence in the 20th century's independence struggles would also share the fate of Latin American and Balkan and Middle Eastern countries politically and economically. The fate lines of East Asian countries, and especially India, China, and South Korea, which went on a very different path, would be very different from those of Latin America, Africa, the Balkans, and the Middle East. Anyway, let's leave the independence wars and revolts of the 19th century and take a look at the July revolutions of 1830 and the revolutions of 1848, which were much deeper and more comprehensive than these revolutions, whose shockwaves affect our lives today. The 1830 revolutions can be partially defined as romantic nationalist revolutions. These revolutions are also known as the July revolutions. Europe was very hot in the summer of 1830. The fire of revolution would add to the temperature. At this time, Italian unity had not yet been established. Italians in northern Italy had been restless under Austrian rule with nationalist fervor since the French Revolution. Poland had previously been divided among Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Russian Poland was a powder keg about to explode. The Belgians, under the Kingdom of the Netherlands, were about to launch an armed uprising. During the July revolutions, the Belgians who rebelled against the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the Italians who rose against the Austrian Empire in Italy, the Poles who revolted against the Russian Empire in Russian Poland, and the provincial uprisings that began in Switzerland might make the July revolutions appear to be independence struggles. However, the situation was different in France, which was the center of gravity of these revolutions. In 1815, with the Congress of Vienna that ended the Napoleonic Wars, the Bourbon dynasty returned to the throne in France. The purpose of the Vienna Order was to prevent nationalist French revolutionary governments born with the French Revolution, or an emperor who could dream of European conquest like Napoleon, from coming to power in the country. Britain, Austria, and the Russian empires, and the Kingdom of Prussia, the victors of the Napoleonic Wars, had placed the Bourbons, from whom the lineage of classical French kings descended, and who had been dethroned by the French Revolution, on the throne. Louis XVIII, who came to power after the Revolution, was the brother of Louis XVI, who lost his throne in the French Revolution and later lost his head on the guillotine. However, the victors of the Napoleonic War were aware that time would not turn backward. The victors, by agreeing with Prince Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, the French foreign minister and a man for all seasons, had made the return of the Bourbons to the throne subject to certain conditions. The new king would accept a two-chamber parliamentary system, and certain rights of citizens would be constitutionally guaranteed. However, this system was more a system between absolute monarchy and parliamentary monarchy than a parliamentary monarchy. The representative structure of the two-chamber system was not even as inclusive as the Estates General before the French Revolution. The holding of elections and the fair determination of their results and the working methods of the parliaments were largely subject to the goodwill of the French king. The royal charter that established the system, namely the Charte constitutionnelle de 1814, was legally not a constitutional text, but, as its name suggests, a royal decree. Things would continue one way or another until 1830, but the intention of Charles X, the successor of Louis XVII, was to return to the time before 1814. In the 6th year of his accession to the throne, he decided to change the royal charter issued in 1814. The king was restricting the right of the bourgeois class to elect the lower chamber, going to new elections with new rules, and press freedom was disappearing. When businessmen who dominated the financial system restricted credit in response to this new royal decree, the economy would come to a standstill. When the angry crowd of workers working in factories that temporarily locked their doors began to arm themselves, the revolution returned to the streets of Paris. The angry crowd would fight in narrow streets of Paris for 3 full days, seizing the critical points of Paris. The king and crown prince would renounce their royal titles and flee to England. The most important changes brought about by the 1830 revolutions were France's transformation into a monarchical kingdom and Belgium's gaining independence from the Netherlands. The House of Orleans, a branch of the Bourbon dynasty, ascended to the French throne, and France had now turned into a full parliamentary monarchy. The great powers, which recognized Belgium's independence 9 years after the revolution with the London Treaty of 1839, would guarantee Belgium's neutrality and independence. To maintain the balance of power in Europe, Belgium would be designed as a neutral Catholic commercial buffer state where French was spoken. The purpose here was to prevent Belgian ports from being used against a possible England. The French had accepted the existence of a neutral Belgium on their borders as a guarantee. Things were not settling down in France. An uprising that began again in July of 1832 was suppressed with a harsh show of force. The new king, Louis Philippe, was quite cautious against revolutionaries. However, the fuse of the main major series of revolutions had long been lit. The unfinished business of the French Revolution would be settled with the revolutions of 1848. The revolutions of 1848 were a tremendous event. The uprisings that began in approximately 50 different countries were disconnected from each other, but shook all of Europe for approximately 20 months. Today's modern political world was shaped by these revolutions. This series of revolutions would be known by romantic names such as the Spring of Nations, and the People's Spring. The Arab Spring we experienced in the 2010s was also named inspired by this tremendous revolution. Of course, those who created the story of the Arab Spring had no connection with the spirit of the 1848 revolutions. The Arab Spring was designed to establish governments close to the Western Bloc in the Middle East. The 1848 revolutions, like many events that changed the world, were based on economic variables. The first industrial revolution had now matured. There had been a complete population explosion in cities, and tremendous numbers of workers working under difficult conditions now constituted a large part of the population of cities. From 1846 onward, problems were experienced in agricultural crop yields in rural areas, such as the potato crisis, and increases in food prices and hunger became widespread. While cities were experiencing an incredible population explosion, there was no infrastructure to protect the health of this population. One of the first crises of modern capitalism, the Panic of 1847, spread from the British banking sector to Europe, creating a complete credit crunch. By the time we reached 1848, all of Europe was about to explode. Workers working 12 to 15 hours a day, food prices peaking, a large portion of average disposable income being spent on food, and consequently a decline in demand for manufactured industrial products. The negative effect of the crisis in credit markets on businesses, increasing unemployment, the presence of many angry nations, primarily homeless Italians, Hungarians, Czechs, and Poles, and the growing deep hatred against wealthy royal families and nobles were the components of this dangerous cocktail. The revolutions would begin in Italy. Let's note that during this period, Italy was largely under the direct and indirect rule and influence of the French Bourbon and Austrian Habsburg dynasties. The revolution in Italy would not be successful, but the foundation for the establishment of unified Italy in 1860 to 1861 had been laid. The center of gravity of the series of revolutions was again France and again Paris. The 1789 French Revolution had created tremendous political awareness and organization in large cities, especially Paris. This political fire could not be extinguished even for 50 full years during the Napoleonic period, the Bourbon dynasty, and the parliamentary monarchy period. During this period in France, a strict ban on assembly and demonstrations was being applied. In cities, intellectuals belonging to the middle class and bourgeoisie were organizing meetings with food and drink, the campaign of banquets, to bypass the bans and gather together. When the government banned these banquets and used police force to raid the meetings, the revolution would suddenly explode, and barricades would again be erected in the streets of Paris. When the National Guard, the Garde Nationale, was dispatched against the insurgents and soldiers joined the insurgents, the government would fall. When the government resigned, things seemed to calm down, but the opening of fire on the crowd gathered in front of the foreign ministry would suddenly pour gasoline on the extinguished revolution. All the people of Paris would rise up reminiscent of 1789. The Hôtel de Ville, Place de la Concorde, and the Tuileries Palace, the famous centers of gravity of the 1789 and 1830 revolutions, would fall into the hands of the insurgents. The king and queen would barely escape with their lives, and the Second Republic period would now begin in France.
The president of this regime was Louis-Napoleon, the nephew of the famous Napoleon Bonaparte. Louis-Napoleon would stage a constitutional coup in 1851, assume extraordinary powers with this coup, and be crowned as Napoleon III in 1852, becoming Emperor of France. Napoleon III was an interesting personality. It was undeniable that he was a genius in domestic politics. Louis-Napoleon's mastery in domestic politics would later serve as an example to Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. The political strategies of both in seizing absolute power were based on the strategy Napoleon III applied in the 1848 to 1852 period. The 1848 revolutions also left a great mark within the German Confederation formed by 39 German states. Nationalist excitement was at its peak in the fragmented Germany. Nationalist fervor enabled the masses to convene a national assembly in Frankfurt.
the Austrian Empire was shaking to its foundations. Revolts broke out in Italy, Hungary, Slovakia, and Bohemia. While the imperial capital Vienna temporarily fell into the hands of insurgents, Chancellor Prince von Metternich, the architect of the Vienna Order, resigned and fled to England. The incredibly large fire of the revolutions did not affect the British Empire and Russia. While the Russians were watching the events in Germany and Austria carefully, when the revolt in Hungary began to succeed, they entered Hungary with a 200,000-strong army under the command of Field Marshal I.F. Paskevich, reaching an agreement with the Austrian Emperor. The revolts that broke out in the entire Austrian Empire, from Lombardy to Hungary, were suppressed. The new emperor, by giving comprehensive autonomy to Hungary, re-established the empire under two crowns. The Austrian Empire had now become the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In the German Confederation, consisting of 39 states, Prussia and Austria, the big brothers of the Confederation, crushed the insurgents using force. And in 1849, the fire of revolution was now extinguished. However, within the German Confederation, the peasants, who made up 90% of the population, had thrown off the yoke of serfdom and forced labor. German nationalism had now emerged from Pandora's famous box. This tremendous social movement would be the cement for the establishment of United Germany in 1870 to 1871. With the 1848 revolutions, the Vienna Order had now effectively ended. The rivalry between the Russian and British empires had begun. The end of this rivalry was a new war, the Crimean War. The Russians turned their eyes to the Ottoman Empire again and entered Wallachia and Moldavia, which make up today's Romania, in 1853. The British would intervene to prevent the status quo in Europe from changing further in favor of Russia. Britain, France, the Kingdom of Sardinia, and the Ottoman Empire would form a coalition against Russia. The war would last 3 years, and Russia would suffer a definite defeat. The Crimean War extended the life of the Ottoman Empire by at least 30 years. Then, the final act in Italy's independence struggle had begun. France and Sardinia had set their sights on the northern Italian territories in the hands of Austria, which had been weakened by the 1848 revolutions. The war that began in 1859 ended in 2 months, and the Austrians lost the regions of Tuscany, Lombardy, and Modena. The French also seized Savoy and Nice, today's famous holiday resorts. In 1861, Italy was unified except for Rome, the center of the papacy, and the Venice region, becoming the Kingdom of Italy. The Italians had finally united, but the final reckoning against Austria would be seen in the Italian-Austrian War of 1866 and in World War I. Napoleon III seemed to have played his cards wisely so far. The French had once again become the greatest power on the continent. However, Napoleon III's place that France should always pay attention to was not Italy or Flanders. To the east of France, a tremendous power was emerging under the rule of Prince Otto von Bismarck, the Prussian chancellor, one of history's most skilled politicians, United Germany. The stage was set, the old order had crumbled, and from the ashes of revolution, a new Europe was being born, one that would soon plunge the world into its darkest chapters. But that's a story for another time.